They called it the Flying Coffin, a nickname whispered in mess halls, scrawled bitterly in half-burned letters on the back of postcards never sent. Imagine the scene: the vast gray skies over northern Europe, January 1943. The air trembles with the vibration of hundreds of radial engines. Below, a continent on fire. Above, a formation of bombers so heavy and so slow that even the youngest gunner knows the odds. Half will not return. Step back for a moment. Picture the entire sky as a chessboard. Black flak bursts carving holes through the pale winter light, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs darting like dark knights across the squares. The B-17s lumber forward, four engines each straining as if dragging not only their bomb loads but also the unbearable weight of destiny. At a distance, it is majestic, an iron armada, wings gleaming in sunlight. Closer in, you smell the oil, the burnt cordite, the sweat freezing on oxygen masks. And then you hear it, the frantic clatter of the .50 caliber machine guns spitting against an enemy that never seems to run out of fighters. Now zoom closer. Inside one of those bombers sits a 19-year-old waste gunner. His fingers are numb, his ears ringing. He watches tracers streak by the window and wonders if the next burst will cut the ship in two. He doesn't think of politics, or maps, or generals. He thinks of the empty chair at his mother's kitchen table if he doesn't make it back. And still, he squeezes the trigger, because in the frozen air war above Europe, hesitation means death. I believe this is where the irony takes hold. The same machine cursed as a coffin would, time and again, stagger home with wings shredded, engine silent, fuselage torn like paper, yet somehow still flying. Veterans swore it could lose half its body and still cradle its crew safely back to England. You will feel the paradox as we dive deeper, how a weapon designed for destruction became, paradoxically, a fortress of survival. So let me take you inside that paradox. Over the next chapters, we'll strip back the myth and the metal. We'll ask hard questions. What made the B-17 endure punishment that should have killed it? What happened to the crews who lived inside its thin aluminum shell? And what can we learn today from the way they fought, bled, and sometimes laughed in the face of annihilation? Stay with us, because this isn't just another tale of a World War II airplane. This is the cinematic, brutal, and oddly human story of the Flying Fortress. And if you find yourself gripped by the images, the sounds, the raw weight of history, then do one thing. Subscribe, join our channel, and help keep these stories alive. They were once whispered by exhausted men staring into the dark over the North Sea. Now they can echo in your living room. When historians trace the contours of the air war over Europe, one number haunts the archives. In 1943 alone, the U.S. 8th Air Force lost nearly 3,500 heavy bombers. Each carried 10 young men, which means more than 30,000 crew either killed, captured, or grievously wounded in a single year. The problem was stark and visible. America had promised a strategy of daylight precision bombing, but Europe's skies were a meat grinder. The setting was England, the so-called unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Allies. Dozens of airfields carved out of the countryside became launch pads for daily raids into Nazi-occupied territory. Reporters who visited those bases described the atmosphere as half industrial plant, half funeral procession. At dawn, long lines of bombers rolled down wet runways, their silver skins reflecting a pale sun. By evening, returning crews counted the gaps in formation, often realizing entire squadrons had vanished in a single mission. Military communiques often spoke of acceptable losses, but personal diaries tell a harsher truth. A navigator from the 306th Bomb Group noted that after 3 missions, he no longer bothered to learn the names of replacement gunners. "Too many ghosts in waiting," he scribbled in the margin of his log. Ground crews, who patched shattered planes with sheet metal and hope, began leaving chalk marks on fuselages. One more mission. Those marks sometimes became epitaphs. The press corps covering the air war faced its own dilemma. How much truth could be told without eroding morale back home? Official releases emphasized the courage of crews and the accuracy of bombing runs. But embedded journalists, those who hitched rides inside the B-17s, returned with stories more harrowing than any headline could contain. One Associated Press correspondent described a cockpit where blood from a wounded pilot had frozen solid across the instrument panel, forcing the co-pilot to chip at it just to read the gauges. Against this backdrop, the B-17 gained its dual reputation. On one hand, the statistics painted it as a slaughterhouse in the sky. Casualty rates on certain raids exceeded 25%, meaning that after 4 missions, a crew had mathematically exhausted its luck. On the other hand, survivors swore by the aircraft's resilience. Stories spread of fortresses limping home with tails shredded, or with gaping holes large enough for a man to crawl through. Reporters latched onto these accounts, building the image of the flying fortress as both coffin and guardian. Strategically, the issue cut to the heart of Allied planning. Could the United States sustain a daylight bombing campaign long enough to cripple German industry? Critics pointed to the Luftwaffe's concentrated defenses and the lethal curtain of flak over cities like Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Supporters argued that precision bombing was the only way to avoid the indiscriminate destruction of civilians. Between these poles, young crews paid the price in blood. Eyewitness testimony reveals the human toll. A surviving waist gunner recalled watching his best friend's plane disintegrate mid-air. It was like a sheet of paper set on fire, folding in on itself. Another remembered the silence in the debriefing room when the roll call fell short. Reporters captured these voices, though often sanitized in print. The public back home read about valor and heroism. Only in unpublished notes do we hear the undercurrent of dread and futility. Yet the paradox deepened. For every fortress shot down in flames, another limped home with one engine and half a crew still alive. Photographs circulated of bombers torn open like tin cans but resting safely on English soil. These images became propaganda gold, proof that American engineering could defy the laws of survival. The same reporters who saw funerals in the morning also wrote captions about "miracle returns" by nightfall. This tension, between catastrophe and resilience, defined the narrative problem of the B-17. Was it a doomed coffin or a fortress that delivered men back to life? The answer depended on which crew you asked, which mission you flew, and whether you returned to tell the story. For journalists, the challenge was to balance the statistics of loss with the visceral testimony of endurance. For analysts, the challenge was to explain how a machine of rivets and aluminum could inspire both terror and faith. And for us, looking back, the question remains. The B-17 became a legend not just because of what it destroyed, but because of what it absorbed. The backdrop of that legend is not merely metal and machinery. It is the faces of thousands who stepped aboard knowing the odds, and the voices of reporters who tried, against censorship and fatigue, to make sense of it all. At the core lies a paradox. The B-17 was simultaneously condemned as a flying coffin and celebrated as a flying fortress. Analysts of the era wrestled with the contradiction. Casualty rates so high they threatened the campaign itself, yet survivability so extraordinary that crews often returned in aircraft that should have disintegrated. The central issue is understanding how design, doctrine, and human endurance intertwine to make this paradox possible. When most people first lay eyes on the B-17, they see a bulky, almost clumsy giant with rivets running across its skin like scars. It doesn't have the sleek elegance of a Spitfire, nor the brutal grace of a Mustang. Yet behind that heavy silhouette lay a design philosophy that was utterly radical for its time: prioritize survival over speed. That decision explains why crews both cursed it as a flying coffin and revered it as the flying fortress. The airframe of the B-17 was never about beauty. Boeing engineers built it around a semi-monocoque structure where the skin of the aircraft did more than cover the bones. It carried the stress of flight. Imagine flak tearing through a wing. On a thinner, lighter design like the B-24 Liberator, the damage would ripple into the spars and snap the structure. But on the B-17, that same hit spread its energy across a web of ribs and stringers. Time and again, crews returned to England in bombers with gaping holes large enough for ground mechanics to crawl through. These weren't miracles of luck. They were the result of deliberate over-engineering. Critics once mocked that excess weight as inefficient. For the men inside, it was the difference between going home and vanishing over Germany. Fuel, the lifeblood of any aircraft, was another battlefield. German fighters often aimed not at engines or wings but at fuel tanks, turning the fortress into a flying torch. To counter this, Boeing wrapped its tanks in layers of rubber that swelled shut when pierced, choking leaks before they could ignite. It wasn't flawless. A lucky incendiary round could still set the sky ablaze. But compared to the Liberator, whose tanks ruptured like paper, the B-17 bought its crews precious chances. It gave them minutes instead of seconds, and in air combat, minutes are eternity. Armament told another part of the story. Early models carried 5 or 6 machine guns. By the time the war reached its deadliest years, the B-17 bristled with up to 13.50 caliber Brownings. These were not symbols, they were lifelines. Gunners at every angle turned the bomber into a porcupine in the sky. German pilots called it a Stahlagel, a steel hedgehog. But the guns alone didn't guarantee survival. What did was the way those guns worked in formation. A lone fortress was prey. A squadron of fortresses overlapping their arcs of fire became something else entirely, a moving fortress wall. Luftwaffe aces, who once dived on RAF bombers with impunity, now found themselves flying into storms of lead, often losing wings, engines, or lives before even reaching effective range. Engines were perhaps the most paradoxical feature. The 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclones weren't the fastest or most reliable engines of the war. They leaked oil, they rattled, they overheated. Yet they had one unmatched quality: resilience. Time after time, B-17s limped home on 3 engines, sometimes 2. There are even tales, half legend, half truth, of bombers staggering back across the Channel on a single coughing engine. When weighed against the high-strung Rolls-Royce Merlins of British fighters or the overcomplicated BMW 801s of German Focke-Wulfs, the Cyclone's crude dependability was an unsung hero. Now compare it directly to its peers. The B-24 Liberator could fly farther, almost 100 miles more, and carry a heavier bomb load. The British Lancaster could carry double the payload, devastating entire cities with a single mission. Yet the B-24's thin wing made it fragile, prone to snapping under stress. The Lancaster, with its vast bomb bay, sacrificed defensive armament. It was a hammer, not a shield. German designs like the He-177 Greif were ambitious but cursed, so unreliable they often caught fire mid-flight. The B-17 was never the best at any single metric, not the fastest, not the longest ranged, not the heaviest lifting. But it was balanced. Balanced enough to take punishment and still fight its way home. That balance is why so many crews who despised the cold, the cramped quarters, and the terrifying missions later admitted, "She brought us back." Inside the fuselage, survival was not an abstraction, it was lived in inches and seconds. The nose gunner crouched in glass, exposed to head-on attacks. The waist gunners worked shoulder to shoulder, brass casings pooling at their boots. The tail gunner sat alone in his turret, a solitary sentinel watching for death out of the sun. In freezing altitudes, where oxygen masks frosted over and skin stuck to metal, the fortress was less an airplane than a steel cage shuddering through the sky. Yet crews often said, if we had to fly to hell itself, we wanted to fly it in a B-17. That contradiction, flying coffin and flying fortress, was etched not in propaganda posters, but in the physics of steel, fire, and blood. It was a machine that demanded suffering from its crews, but in return offered them something priceless: a chance. Altitude was both the fortress's greatest shield and its deadliest enemy. Crews flew at 25,000 feet and beyond, where German flak shells arced black blossoms into the sky. At such heights, oxygen wasn't a luxury, it was survival. A failed mask, a frozen valve, and within seconds a man would slump unconscious, his lips turning blue. Many crews spoke of the strange, dreamlike euphoria of hypoxia, as though the body was tricked into serenity even as it suffocated. Some died quietly in their seats, mistaken for resting until the mission ended. Engineers had designed oxygen lines to snake across the fuselage, but frost and brittle tubing made them fragile. In a way, the very altitude that kept them above most German guns also killed silently from within. Bomb load was another compromise carved into steel. Each fortress could carry around 4,000 to 5,000 pounds on long-range missions. It was enough to devastate factories, rail yards, or U-boat pens, but not the saturation that the Lancaster could unleash with 12,000 pounds or more. Critics pointed to this as inefficiency. Why send hundreds of planes when fewer Lancasters could do the same? Yet the answer again was survival. The B-17 could not drown cities in fire like the British. It could, however, survive in enough numbers to return and repeat, day after day, grinding the German war machine with attrition instead of annihilation. The fortress was not a hammer, it was a file, wearing down steel through endless strokes. Inside, every compartment told a story of human cost. The ball turret, slung beneath the belly, was perhaps the most infamous. Barely large enough for a man, it was a coffin of glass and steel suspended in open sky. Crews joked grimly that if the landing gear failed, the ball turret gunner would be the first casualty. There was no room for a parachute inside. If the turret jammed in combat, escape was almost impossible. Yet those gunners, isolated and exposed, often accounted for dozens of kills. Their world was a bubble of spinning tracers, where survival was measured in trigger squeezes. Heat was absent. At 25,000 feet, the air temperature dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Gloves froze stiff. Guns iced over. Flesh stuck to bare aluminum. Men urinated into bottles only to watch the liquid freeze solid. The fortress carried no armor against the cold. This was suffering built into the design, because every pound spent on heating was a pound lost to bombs or fuel. The engineers had decided, better to risk frostbite than fail the mission. Survivors remembered frostbitten fingers turning black, ears and noses dying in the slipstream. Yet they flew again, because the fortress gave them something worth enduring, a higher chance to live than in any other bomber. Resilience was not only about structure or armor, it was about psychology. Crews believed in the B-17 because they saw it endure. They saw a wing shredded, and the plane still flying. They saw entire tails nearly severed, yet the fortress staggered back to England. They saw engines engulfed in fire, cut loose, and still the aircraft held altitude. Belief is as vital as steel in war. A bomber crew climbing into a Lancaster or Liberator knew the odds of return were grim. In the fortress, even when facing 1,000 guns over the Ruhr, there lingered a dangerous, precious hope: we might make it home. And yet, the fortress was no invulnerable titan. Its very strengths carried hidden costs. Defensive guns made it heavy and slow. Crews often cursed that they were easy targets for Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that could dart in and out, firing cannons at will. The armor and structure that saved lives also strained engines, making takeoffs treacherous for muddy English fields. Bomb loads were limited, meaning each mission risked many lives for relatively small results. To the men inside, the Flying Coffin nickname was no invention of cynics. It was born of seeing empty bunks the morning after a raid. Still, when placed in context of its era, the B-17 was less a weapon of precision than of endurance. It was designed not to win quickly, but to endure long enough that victory could be ground out over months and years. Its engineering was a reflection of American strategy itself, overwhelming persistence, wearing down an enemy until collapse. And that is why, decades later, veterans still spoke of the fortress with awe and grief in equal measure. It demanded suffering, but in exchange, it gave something no soldier ever took for granted: a chance to see another sunrise. Dawn broke cold and gray over the English countryside, the kind of half-light that seemed made for war. On runways carved for muddy fields, the B-17s crouched like hulking beasts, silver skin wet with dew, bomb bays yawning open as armorers loaded their lethal cargo. Engines coughed to life one by one until the air vibrated with the deep, rolling thunder of 100 Wright cyclones. Men strapped into their seats, pulling oxygen masks close, gloves stiff with frost, eyes fixed on the horizon. The fortress lurched forward, straining under the weight of fuel and bombs. Mud and frost sprayed from the wheels before the aircraft clawed itself into the air. Climbing through low clouds, it joined others until the sky filled with silver wings, weaving into their disciplined box formations. From the ground, it looked majestic, like an unstoppable armada. But every man in the air knew the truth. Beauty was fragile, and ahead lay the flak alleys of Europe where only some of these planes would return. On August 17, 1943, that fragility was laid bare. The mission was audacious. Twin targets, Regensburg and Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. One aimed to cripple Messerschmitt factories, the other to sever the production of ball bearings, the tiny steel spheres on which every tank tread, every propeller shaft, every war machine depended. The stakes could not have been higher. As the formations crossed the Channel, German radar tracked their progress. Controllers scrambled squadrons of Bf-109s and Fw-190s, waiting for the moment to pounce. Soon, contrails streaked the sky, and the attack began. Fighters tore through the bomber stream, cannons and machine guns raking aluminum hides. The disciplined combat box, once neat geometry, dissolved into chaos. Gunners spat thousands of rounds, tracer fire lacing the sky, but the enemy pressed in mercilessly. Survivors remembered the scene as a kaleidoscope of smoke and flame. One waste gunner described watching an entire fortress vanish in a single flash, its pieces spinning down like confetti. Another crew fought with their bare hands to hold oxygen masks against faces as shrapnel ripped hoses apart. At 20,000 feet, there was no second chance. 15 seconds without oxygen, and men slumped unconscious, lips turning blue. By mission's end, 60 B-17s had been lost from just 376 dispatched. More than 500 airmen were dead, missing, or captured. The ball-bearing plants suffered damage, but not destruction. The mission was judged inconclusive. Statistically, a crewman's chances of surviving a 25-mission tour after Regensburg and Schweinfurt fell to near zero. And yet, the raid carved its place in history not only through loss, but through revelation. The fortress had endured punishment beyond reason. Crews limped home in aircraft peppered with hundreds of holes, landing gear jammed, engines silent, fuselages torn open yet somehow holding together. One fortress returned with its entire tail nearly severed, another on fire for hours, another with its navigator killed but his charts still clutched in frozen fingers. The paradox grew sharper. How could a plane that cost so many lives also be the one most likely to bring its wounded home? Strategists studied the losses with grim precision. Without long-range escort fighters, the fortress was a wounded beast in the air, its defensive guns formidable but not invincible. The box formation multiplied firepower but also presented predictable targets for flak. Engineers and commanders debated whether to continue daylight precision raids at all, or abandon them for the safer shadows of night as the British had done. Still, the B-17 went back up. It had to. To halt would be to surrender the skies. To falter would be to leave Germany's war machine untouched. Crews climbed back into their planes, strapping themselves again into frozen cockpits, as though the last raid had taught them nothing. In truth, it had taught them everything, that survival was as much a matter of faith in the machine as of strategy. The winter of 1944 turned the sky over Europe into a brutal testing ground. By then, the American 8th Air Force had committed itself fully to the doctrine of daylight precision bombing. The logic was clear. To dismantle the Reich's industry, its rail lines, and its cities, they had to strike when targets could be seen. Night cloaked the British raids, but it also cloaked their bombs in imprecision. For the Americans, the price of daylight was blood, and the men inside the fortresses paid it in gallons. Berlin, the heart of Hitler's empire, became the symbol of that price. Orders to strike the capital carried both a military and psychological weight. Crews were told they were making history, bringing the war directly to the Nazi regime. Yet no one mistook the danger. The city was ringed with one of the densest anti-aircraft defenses on Earth, batteries of 88mm guns that could throw a curtain of steel across the sky, flak towers bristling like medieval castles, and the Luftwaffe's best units waiting to swarm any intruder. As the formations neared the city, the air turned black with bursts. Shells detonated in patterns so thick that gunners swore it was like flying into a wall. Each detonation sent shards of hot metal slicing into wings, engines, or flesh. The sound was not a boom but a constant percussion, a hammering that shook rivets loose and rattled bones. Crews described the sensation of flying blind inside a storm of smoke and shockwaves, the horizon lost in flashes of orange and black. And yet, for the first time, there was a new player in the sky, the long-range escort fighter. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed the entire character of the air war. Sleek, fast, and with range enough to accompany the bombers deep into Germany, the Mustang could duel with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs on equal terms. Suddenly, the fortress was no longer alone. Its guns still spat defiance, but the swarming enemy now had to look over their shoulders for diving Mustangs. The difference was immediate. Losses dropped. Morale, which had sagged after Schweinfurt, began to recover. Crews still climbed into their planes with knots in their stomachs, but the hopelessness had eased. Now, when the Luftwaffe fell upon the formations, they found themselves harried by fighters as persistent as wolves. The balance of survival tilted, if only slightly, back toward the bombers. Still, Berlin demanded sacrifice. On March 6, 1944, more than 60 bombers were lost in a single day over the capital. Each returning aircraft carried its own tragedy. Waist gunners staggered out with faces blackened from smoke. Navigators stumbled off with bandaged hands where frostbite and fire had left scars. Some crews never made it past debriefing, collapsing into silence as the enormity of the day sank in. The fortress had carried them through, but the cost was carved into empty bunks and unopened letters waiting back in the barracks. The raids on Berlin revealed another truth about the B-17. Its value was not measured only in bombs dropped, but in the pressure it exerted on the enemy. The Luftwaffe could not ignore the streams of silver shapes over their capital. Every fighter diverted to chase bombers was one less over the front lines in Russia or Italy. Every flak shell fired skyward drained Germany's resources of powder, steel, and manpower. Even raids that seemed failures on the surface, with factories quickly rebuilt, had a corrosive effect on the Reich's capacity to wage war. And for the men inside the planes, survival itself became a strange form of victory. They told each other stories of aircraft that came back missing engines, with tails shredded, with wings patched like quiltwork. One legendary fortress, nicknamed All-American, returned from Tunisia with its fuselage nearly severed by a collision. Photographs of it, still flying despite a yawning gap through its body, circulated among air crews as proof that the fortress truly could take punishment beyond imagination. Yet every act of survival was shadowed by loss. On return from a mission, the silence in the barracks spoke louder than the roar of engines. Bunks stripped bare. Trunks unopened. Cigarettes left behind. A man missing meant not just a comrade gone, but a reminder. The fortress could save, but it could not save all. The paradox deepened with every mission. The B-17 inspired confidence, yet it carried crews into the most lethal sky in history. It was a machine both trusted and feared, a savior and a coffin. And as the bombers turned back toward England after hammering Berlin, the sun setting behind their torn wings, no man on board doubted that the battle for the air had entered a new and terrible phase. By 1945, the B-17 campaign had become relentless, a grinding drumbeat that echoed across occupied Europe. The targets shifted with the war's changing tides. No longer just ball bearings or factories, the bombers now sought to choke Germany's very lifeblood, its fuel. Oil refineries at Ploiești, synthetic fuel plants at Luna, rail junctions that funneled coal and supplies to the front. Every strike was aimed not only at production but at strangling mobility itself. The raids on Ploiești were legend even before the fortress joined them. Low-level attacks by other aircraft had shown how well defended the oil fields were, ringed with flak that could tear a plane apart before it reached the target. When the B-17s entered the campaign, they did so from altitude, trusting their strength and the growing presence of escorts. The missions were brutal. Columns of smoke rose for miles, flames painted the sky, and crews felt the concussion of their own bombs as though the earth itself was fighting back. Losses were heavy, but every refinery destroyed was fuel denied to panzer divisions and Luftwaffe squadrons. Elsewhere, the raids reached into the industrial heartland with unrelenting force. Dresden became one of the most infamous names in the war, a city reduced to ruins by a combination of American daylight raids and British night firebombing. For the men in the B-17s, Dresden was another target on another morning, briefed in cold terms: rail yards, communication centers, industrial districts. They did not see the firestorm that consumed the city below. They felt the jolt of flak, the hammer of turbulence, the eerie silence when bombs left the bay. The destruction beneath remained abstract, visible only as smoke that swallowed the horizon. By then, the Luftwaffe was faltering. Years of attrition had bled it white. The Mustangs and Thunderbolts now swept the skies with near impunity, hunting the few fighters still able to rise. For bomber crews, this shift was palpable. Missions still killed, flak still shredded wings, but the days of entire formations being torn apart by waves of German fighters were fading. Survival odds ticked upward, though never enough to banish the dread that clung to every pre-flight briefing. What grew heavier instead was exhaustion. Crews who had survived 15, 20 missions showed the strain in their eyes, hollowed and distant. Some shook uncontrollably before takeoff, hands trembling as they adjusted flight suits. Others fell into silence, muttering prayers or staring at the floor. The fortress demanded endurance not just from steel but from the flesh within it, and by late war, that endurance was stretched to breaking. Yet the B-17 had achieved what its designers promised. It had carried war to the enemy's heart, day after day, until the weight of bombs and blood forced a reckoning. German cities lay in rubble, transport crippled, factories starving for parts, oil supplies dwindling. The bomber offensive did not win the war alone, but without it, the Reich might have lasted far longer. When peace finally came, and the guns fell silent, the fortresses began to disappear. Many were scrapped where they stood, their aluminum skins melted down into the raw material of peacetime. Others lingered, relics flown back to America or pressed into service elsewhere. For the men who had flown them, the loss was bittersweet. They had cursed the cold, the noise, the terror of each mission. They had called the B-17 a coffin, a frozen prison, a machine that demanded sacrifice. But they had also seen it save lives against impossible odds, carrying them home when physics itself seemed to demand they fall from the sky. The legend of the Flying Fortress was not born in factories or design offices. It was forged in flak-scarred skies, in the sweat and blood of airmen who trusted their steel companion to bring them back. That is why decades later, when veterans gathered beneath museum displays or stood before restored aircraft, their eyes often brimmed with tears. The machine was cold aluminum, yet it had held their lives in its wings. In their memories, it was not just a weapon of war, but a companion, deadly, unforgiving, and somehow, in its brutal way, faithful. By the end of the war, the B-17 had established a reputation both revered and scrutinized. Compared to its contemporaries, its strengths and weaknesses became brutally clear. The Liberator could fly farther and carry more bombs. The Lancaster could devastate entire industrial districts, yet neither could match the Fortress in sheer survivability. Engineers and tacticians debated endlessly over these trade-offs, questioning whether America had prioritized the right metrics for success. The Liberator's thin wings and light frame made it faster and capable of longer ranges, but fragile. A single well-placed hit could tear it apart, leaving crews with little hope of returning. The Lancaster, a British masterpiece of payload, sacrificed defensive firepower for its colossal bomb bays. It relied on stealth or the cover of darkness, not armor or guns, and yet it achieved destruction levels the B-17 could not. By contrast, the B-17 was never the fastest, the most elegant, or the heaviest bomber. Its genius lay in balance, a combination of armor, guns, and structural integrity that allowed men to survive where other aircraft would fail. But that balance came with costs. Early American doctrine underestimated the lethality of flak and fighter interception. Bombers were sent in daylight, in tight formations, relying on mutual defensive firepower but lacking long-range fighter escort. Schweinfurt and Regensburg exposed the limits of this approach. Losses spiked, missions teetered on the brink of disaster, and strategists realized that even the strongest aircraft could not compensate for flawed tactics. It was a lesson paid for in human lives. The aircraft's defensive armament, while formidable, was not infallible. 13.50 caliber machine guns could deter many fighters, but it did not guarantee immunity. Pilots and gunners found that concentrated attacks from blind spots, head-on or from below, could overwhelm the formations. Over time, tactical adjustments mitigated these vulnerabilities. Flying in combat boxes maximized overlapping fields of fire, and the arrival of long-range P-51 Mustangs shifted the equation decisively. Still, the mistakes of early 1943 left scars that could never fully heal. Mechanical limitations also revealed themselves under stress. The Wright Cyclone engines were robust but not invincible. High-altitude icing, oil leaks, and fire hazards challenged crews on every mission. The B-17's control surfaces, while rugged, became sluggish under damage. A bent aileron, a punctured stabilizer, or a torn rudder could reduce maneuverability to near zero. Pilots learned to compensate through ingenuity, asymmetric thrust, careful banking, and sheer luck. In essence, survival depended on both the machine's design and the human ability to exploit it. Comparisons also highlighted doctrine mistakes. Night raids reduced casualties but compromised accuracy. Daylight raids increased precision but raised exposure to fighters and flak. The American approach favored precision and attrition, believing that repeated, survivable raids would gradually dismantle German capacity. Critics pointed out that without long-range escorts, early missions were near suicidal, a gamble that could have crippled the bomber force before the arrival of P-51s. The strategy was sound in theory but brutal in execution, and it relied on a forgiving aircraft that could absorb punishment better than almost any other in history. The B-17's endurance also influenced enemy behavior. German fighters had to contend not only with overlapping defensive fire but with formations that could replace losses quickly. Factories and refineries were hard targets, but the persistence of the bomber streams imposed logistical and psychological stress. The Luftwaffe could not simply shoot its way to victory. It faced an opponent whose durability forced attrition into every decision. In hindsight, this was as much a strategic advantage as bombs themselves. Yet, mistakes persisted. High-altitude precision bombing often failed to hit dispersed targets, and crews sometimes wasted missions due to poor weather, navigation errors, or miscommunication. Bombing accuracy could be off by miles, turning factories into rubble but leaving production lines intact. The early overconfidence in the fortress's defensive capabilities occasionally led to heavy losses. Commanders and crews learned through harsh trial and error that no machine, however well designed, could replace doctrine, planning, and situational awareness. Ultimately, the B-17 story is one of calculated trade-offs. It was not perfect, but it was resilient. It punished the enemy by surviving when others would fail. Its mistakes, those of design, doctrine, and human error, were often inseparable from its triumphs. The Flying Fortress achieved a balance few machines have ever managed. It demanded sacrifice, yet it offered survival. It carried bombs to destroy, yet carried men home. Every flaw became a lesson, every victory a validation of its unique engineering philosophy. By the time peace returned, the B-17 had become a benchmark. It defined what survivable, strategic bombing could be, teaching the world, and the military, that an aircraft's worth was measured not solely in payload, speed, or range, but in the lives it preserved and the missions it could complete. By the end of the European campaign, the B-17's impact was undeniable. The relentless bombing of factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs had not only stripped Germany of vital resources but also reshaped the psychology of war. The Luftwaffe, once confident in its ability to dominate the skies, had been forced into defensive desperation. Pilots flew with the knowledge that each mission was a struggle not just against the enemy but against the very limits of endurance. For the airmen themselves, the consequences were deeply personal. PTSD, frostbite, permanent injuries, and the memory of comrades lost haunted those who returned. Letters home, photographs of empty bunks, and tales of planes returning riddled with holes became part of a shared consciousness among veterans. They spoke of the B-17 not merely as a machine but as a companion that demanded respect, fear, and, ultimately, gratitude. Its design philosophy, sacrificing elegance for survivability, had tangible consequences. Men survived, missions were completed, and the war's momentum shifted. The strategic impact extended far beyond the immediate destruction. Cities like Dresden, Leipzig, and Berlin bore the scars of relentless precision raids. Rail networks were fragmented, fuel reserves plummeted, and the industrial backbone of the Reich began to collapse. While no single raid could end the war, The cumulative effect of repeated B-17 missions imposed attrition that was both physical and psychological. German commanders could no longer mass forces or concentrate defenses without risking annihilation. In effect, the Flying Fortress had become both weapon and deterrent, an airborne embodiment of sustained pressure. But the story does not end in Europe. The lessons learned from the B-17 campaign reverberated in military strategy, aircraft design, and aerial doctrine for decades. Post-war bomber programs, both in the U.S. and abroad, prioritized survivability, redundancy, and crew safety in ways that echoed the fortress's philosophy. The emphasis on formation tactics, overlapping defensive fields, and combined arms integration can all trace roots back to what men learned above flak-scorched skies in 1943 and 1944. At the same time, the B-17 legacy shaped popular imagination. Movies, documentaries, and memoirs immortalized missions of courage, endurance, and ingenuity. Veterans recounted stories of planes returning with engine fires, missing tail sections, and gunners still firing as if the aircraft itself were sentient. These narratives reinforced the dual identity of the fortress, feared by enemies, revered by its crews, and remembered as a symbol of resilience and human determination. For viewers today, there is a crucial lesson. Understanding the B-17 is not just about marveling at aluminum and rivets. It is about appreciating the intersection of technology, strategy, and human courage. Every hole in a fuselage, every burst of flak, every near miss tells a story of calculated risk, engineering ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of mission objectives. When we watch restored B-17's taxi across modern runways or see archival footage of formations piercing the clouds, we glimpse the physical manifestation of that philosophy, a machine designed to survive, to endure, and to carry men home against overwhelming odds. And speaking of witnessing history come alive, if you're intrigued by these stories of endurance, courage, and engineering marvels, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an in-depth exploration of historical aircraft and the missions that define them. Watching these planes in flight, understanding the science behind their design, and hearing the first-hand accounts of the men who flew them adds a layer of connection that textbooks alone can't provide. Every mission, every technical detail, every personal story is brought to life in our videos, and subscribing ensures you're part of that journey. The B-17 also reminds us of the broader consequences of warfare. While the aircraft itself was a triumph of engineering, it existed within a machinery of destruction that claimed countless civilian and military lives. The juxtaposition of its technological brilliance and the human cost it carried offers a sobering reminder. Progress in design and strategy is inseparable from ethical considerations. History invites us to study both, the remarkable resilience of the Flying Fortress and the devastation it delivered, in order to understand the full spectrum of aerial warfare. Looking back, the legacy of the B-17 is etched in multiple dimensions: tactical innovation, industrial achievement, crew endurance, and strategic influence. The Fortress proved that a well-designed, balanced aircraft could reshape entire theaters of war, carry the weight of repeated attrition, and still bring men home. Its story is not just about aluminum and engines, but about human ingenuity surviving in the face of relentless adversity. Even today, as restored B-17s soar across skies at air shows, the echoes of those missions are tangible. Observers can see the same airframe that braved flak and fighters, feel the historical gravity of missions that defined modern aerial combat, and connect to the men who once trusted their lives to a machine that was both deadly and protective. That is the enduring power of the Flying Fortress, its ability to tell a story that spans technology, human courage, and history itself. So as you continue exploring these remarkable machines, remember to like this video and share it with others who appreciate history in vivid detail. Every comment, every share, helps preserve these stories for future generations, ensuring that the bravery, strategy, and engineering of the B-17 remain alive not just in museums, but in the hearts and minds of viewers around the world. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress is a study in paradox. It was both feared and revered, a harbinger of destruction and a vessel of survival. Across thousands of missions, it carried men into some of the most lethal skies in history, subjected to flak, fighters, and the merciless extremes of altitude and cold. And yet, in its metal bones, in its design philosophy, and in the courage it inspired, it carried countless crews home, riddled with holes, battered by combat, but flying. From a strategic perspective, the B-17 demonstrated that endurance could be as decisive as firepower. Precision bombing, while costly, gradually undermined the German war machine. Factories slowed production, fuel reserves dwindled, and the Luftwaffe was forced into defensive desperation. The lessons of those missions resonate today. Survival, redundancy, and crew safety are as crucial to mission success as the ordnance carried. Technology alone does not guarantee results. How it is employed, and how human beings interact with it under pressure, defines its ultimate effectiveness. At the human level, the Flying Fortress was more than steel and engines. It was a test of resilience, ingenuity, and courage. Gunners froze in exposed positions, navigators plotted courses through lethal skies, pilots coaxed wounded aircraft home with fractured wings. Each mission demanded improvisation, teamwork, and trust, not just in each other, but in a machine designed to endure what seemed unendurable. This dynamic forged bonds and legends that persist in memory and history alike. Yet the B-17 also serves as a cautionary tale. The early losses over Schweinfurt and Regensburg highlighted the cost of flawed doctrine, overconfidence, and underestimating the enemy. It reminds us that no engineering marvel can fully compensate for human error or strategic misjudgment. The blend of innovation, analysis, and adaptability is what ultimately tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. The legacy of the Flying Fortress extends beyond war. It influenced aircraft design for decades, instilling the principles of survivability, redundancy, and integrated defensive capabilities. Its lessons continue to inform both military and civilian aviation, from the value of structural resilience to the importance of crew-centered engineering. And culturally, it became a symbol, a testament to human endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. As we reflect on the B-17, its lessons are clear. Courage and technology are intertwined. Strategy and adaptation matter as much as raw firepower. And, above all, survival is often as significant as victory. These lessons transcend the skies of World War II, offering insight into any challenge where risk, innovation, and human endurance intersect. If you found yourself drawn into these stories of resilience and ingenuity, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Each video uncovers the engineering, the human drama, and the history behind the machines that shaped our world. By watching, sharing, and engaging, you help keep these stories alive, stories of courage, innovation, and survival that continue to inspire decades later. In the end, the B-17 Flying Fortress reminds us that history is not just written in victories, but in the endurance of those who faced impossible odds. It is the courage to climb into the cockpit, to confront the flak, the fighters, the freezing altitudes, and still press on, that defines both the machine and the men who trusted it. And perhaps, in that fusion of metal and human spirit, we find one of the clearest lessons of all, that greatness is forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of challenge, risk, and unyielding resolve.